Tien Truong is a gambling counsellor with the Australian Vietnamese Women's Association. His interests in gambling help uncover what purpose gambling services serves for the people who see him, to help lessen gambling harm and to explore more constructive coping strategies, helping families affected by gambling, understanding gambling behaviour to reduce stigma, and increasing desire from the gambler to seek help are the priorities in his work. Ian Ferretter is a community educator from Gamblers Help West. He's a former secondary school teacher in Melbourne's West, and Ian worked for Quit Victoria for almost 20 years and became a world expert in tobacco control. He ran state and nationwide prevention projects for school students and was a member of teams that produced an award-winning health CD-ROM and the first tobacco control website for young people. And for the past 18 months, he's been putting his extensive experience into practice at Gamblers Help West. So I think Tien is going to go first, but Tien and then Ian.
Hey everyone, my name's Tien Truong and I'm a gambling counsellor at Australian Vietnamese Women's Association. So here we provide culturally sensitive services to the Vietnamese community, such as gambling, drug and alcohol, and aged care services. So I've been invited here to share stories about gambling harm experience in the Vietnamese community. But before that, I think it's important for everyone to know how addiction begins in the first place. People addicted to gambling face a lot of stigma about how much free will they have in their choice to harm themselves and others. So it's helpful to start off by seeing addiction as a disease of the brain that can lead people to harm those around them rather than a choice based on a lack of morals. So I want everyone to think about a time they've been a victim to someone who has been hangry or been hangry yourself. You probably notice people get pretty emotional and their thinking becomes pretty cloudy. And that's because when you feel extremely hungry, the thinking brain gets turned down. It's important to remember some feelings happen on a level we don't think about or control, especially ones about our survival. Just imagine getting lost in the outback and starving for weeks. You'd be obsessed with looking for food and always feeling hungry. It would be hard to think clearly about anything else because the survival brain turns up when we feel a threat to our survival, like no food. It controls our thoughts, feelings, and actions without us even realizing. Say we got full because we killed and ate a kangaroo. Our thinking brain turns back up and we can think clearly again. These two brains are always competing based on the level of risk we feel to our survival. So our survival brain uses a chemical called dopamine to keep us chasing after the things we need to survive, like water, sex, food, and friendships. Dopamine wires our brain to keep chasing, especially when we keep failing. Let's say you were lost in the outback and had no dopamine. After a few minutes of throwing your spear at a kangaroo, you'd probably say, screw this, I'm turning vegan, and stick to eating grass and soon die from malnutrition. The issue with gambling is it completely messes with what the survival brain thinks we need to survive, releasing 10 times the amount of dopamine than naturally possible or through natural activities. This strongly wires some people's brains to think gambling is needed for survival at a much stronger level than natural, causing those people to keep chasing a win even when they keep losing and their life falls apart around them. This is because for vulnerable or sensitive brains, the wiring becomes much stronger than, say, the need to eat, which is why you might have heard about people who go for days on end on a machine without ever eating or sleeping. Once this wiring happens, the survival brain causes very strong cravings for the gambling in the face of stress. Gambling cravings can be triggered by life stresses, so like hunger, but on steroids, it makes it much harder to think clearly about risks and long and short-term consequences, making gambling harm less of a thought or consideration to those affected. Gambling companies spend millions on research to make sure machines and games better exploit people's survival brains, and to keep as many people hooked possible. So now hopefully everyone has a better understanding of how gambling can change the brain. So I'd like to talk about gambling in the Vietnamese community. So a lot of first-generation Vietnamese refugees came here with no English, meaning there wasn't many things they could do for fun. A lot felt socially isolated and felt that Crown was a place where they felt a sense of community, since a lot of Vietnamese people hung around here. However, there's also a lot of opportunistic people who take advantage of vulnerable people addicted to gambling. They befriend them and they track their spending, and once they see that the gamblers are empty-handed, they offer to help, lending tens of thousands of dollars at up to 10% interest rate per week, which ends up being about 5 times the amount they borrowed by the end of the year. For some, the offer of money triggers the survival brain and they take it. And because of their poor thinking, many believe they can win it back easily or don't consider the consequences if they lose it all. All they see is the money to feed their cravings to gamble. The thing is, lenders never accept installments and demand a lump sum the borrower usually can't afford. They begin harassing and threatening those who owe them, and that fear and stress triggers the survival brain, which can lead to bad decisions for vulnerable people. Out of desperation, some steal from a community bank known as Hui, which is a lending system in the Vietnamese culture where they can withdraw up to $20,000 from friends and even family, which leads to a whole host of other problems. Then there's the more worrying drug gangs, who lenders tend to suggest gamblers work for as cannabis crop sitters or mules for heroin trafficking in order to pay them back. The gangs can lend directly to the vulnerable people and threaten and coerce them into the drug trade in order to pay off debts they knew the gamblers never could afford. This isn't rare either. In a survey of 600 ethnic Vietnamese offenders in Australia, 72% said that they felt forced or pressured into the drug trade to pay off gambling debts. It becomes a light at the end of the tunnel for completely desperate people drowning in debt. $20,000 can be made in one trip heroin trafficking, and $5,000 to $10,000 a month for crop sitting. People I have seen have mentioned that even though a lot of money is made, most drug traffickers in prison come in with their hands empty because it all goes into the casino. This doesn't excuse crime, but it does give a background to people who have committed crimes, which is important since drug traffickers are made out as morally corrupt, greedy criminals. And this is where barriers to finding help stem from, shame and stigma. I think most of us would never think of telling somebody dying from cancer that they are not trying hard enough, or why not just stop spreading their cancer around. In the same way we see that people's immune systems are weak, making them sick, we as a society should see that some people's brains are wired so that they can easily become addicted. When the survival brain makes people do things they know are bad and hurtful, it creates so much shame and guilt because they don't understand why they keep gambling. They keep beating themselves up over the harm they cause, and to feel better about themselves, many are forced to rationalize, justify, and deny their actions. Shame and stigma is more true in the Vietnamese community because saving face and honoring family is pretty much the most important thing to us. Both are major barriers for seeking help because you don't tell anybody in your family about your mental problems, let alone an outsider. In fact, there's no word in the Vietnamese language for counsellor. I'm considered a consultant in our flyers that we hand out. I hope that by more people spreading compassion and understanding for people addicted to gambling, we can better understand and talk about these issues so that affected people will be more open to the idea of getting help. I think we've come a long way in terms of reducing stigma around mental health issues like depression and suicide. Hopefully gambling will follow suit, as 1 in 5 suicides involve gambling debts, and 36% of problem gamblers experience severe mental illness, compared to about 3% of the broader population. From what I've heard and come across, many people use gambling as a form of escape and to cope with negative feelings. And for many Vietnamese people, it is the only place they feel they can meet and make friends. I'm sure many of us have heard that the cure to addiction is connection. Hopefully more people begin to show compassion and understanding for a gambling addict's situation, and from that they can realize that help in a different life is always available. Thanks.